The fastest way to find out someone has been lying about the law is to let them explain it in front of a judge. The sharp knock hit my front door at exactly 7:12 on a Tuesday morning. 3 knocks. Slow. Confident. The kind of knock people use when they believe they own the next few minutes of your life. I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee when it happened. The smell of dark roast drifted through the house, mixing with the faint scent of old cedar from the ranch home my father built 40 years ago. Outside, the sprinklers ticked across the neighboring lawns with perfect suburban precision. Another knock followed. Harder this time. I walked toward the front window and pulled the curtain back an inch. 3 men stood on my porch wearing matching charcoal suits despite the Texas heat already pushing past 80 degrees. One carried a thick legal folder under his arm. Another held a tablet. The third looked like he spent his weekends billing people by the hour. Parked behind them was a black luxury SUV with the logo of a law firm I recognized immediately. That was interesting, because I had never hired them. The oldest lawyer glanced at his watch and shook his head impatiently. Through the glass, I could hear muffled voices. They sounded irritated, like people forced to visit someone they already considered defeated. I set my coffee mug down and watched them for a few more seconds. Across the street, curtains moved. Neighbors were watching. They always watched, especially since Patricia Whitmore had decided I was the newest problem in Willow Creek Estates. Patty had a talent for turning ordinary disagreements into community emergencies. A mailbox color became a property value crisis. A pickup truck became a threat to neighborhood standards. A garden shed became a legal matter. For 6 months, she had treated HOA authority like it came with a crown and a throne. Every week seemed to bring another letter, another notice, another warning printed on expensive paper. Most people folded after the second or third threat. Apparently, Patty expected me to do the same. The funny thing was, I almost admired the confidence. Almost. The doorbell rang. Long this time. Deliberate. I could practically hear the impatience behind it. The younger lawyer shifted his weight and looked toward the street. That's when I noticed something else. 2 houses down, Patty sat inside her white Lexus parked near the curb. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Her oversized sunglasses reflected the morning sunlight as she watched my front porch like it was opening night on Broadway. The metallic taste of amusement touched the back of my tongue. She had actually shown up to witness this. Whatever these attorneys were carrying, she expected it to end my resistance once and for all. Another knock echoed through the house. I glanced toward the hallway, toward a closed door most visitors never noticed. Behind it hung something I hadn't worn outside of work in weeks. The lawyers had no idea. Patty definitely had no idea. And that was the problem with people who mistake silence for weakness. They stop asking questions. The oldest attorney adjusted his tie and raised his hand to knock again. Before his knuckles touched the wood, I unlocked the deadbolt. The sound seemed louder than it should have. All 3 men immediately straightened. I opened the door slowly. Warm summer air rolled inside. For a second, nobody spoke. The attorney holding the folder opened his mouth first, then stopped. The younger one blinked twice. The third man's expression collapsed completely. I understood why. Standing in the doorway, I wasn't wearing jeans anymore. I wasn't wearing a work shirt. I wasn't the retired homeowner Patty had spent 6 months trying to intimidate. I was wearing my federal judge's robe. The morning breeze moved the edge of the black fabric as I looked at all 3 attorneys and said the only thing that came to mind. Gentlemen, before we begin, would any of you like to explain why you're standing on my porch with documents that should never have been drafted in the first place? The silence on my porch lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt a lot longer. The oldest attorney cleared his throat and looked down at the folder in his hands as if the paperwork might suddenly save him. Behind them, through the windshield of her Lexus, Patty Whitmore sat perfectly still. Even from 60 feet away, I could tell she was trying to understand what had just happened. The thing about assumptions is that they work right up until reality shows up. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand who I was before anyone in Willow Creek Estates ever learned my title. My name is Nathan Walker. I am 58 years old, and for most of my life I have believed that the less attention a man attracts, the easier life becomes. My father taught me that. He built this house with his own hands when I was 10 years old. I still remember the smell of fresh lumber baking under the Texas sun and the sound of hammers echoing across an empty field where subdivisions had not yet arrived. Back then, this entire area was open land. No HOA. No committees. No newsletters reminding grown adults what color their mailbox should be. Just families trying to build decent lives. After law school, I spent years working my way through the court system. Long hours, endless case files, more coffee than any doctor would recommend. Eventually, I earned a federal appointment. It was the proudest day of my professional life, but it also taught me something important. Titles make people act differently. The second someone hears the word judge, they stop talking to you like a human being. Some become nervous. Some become fake. Some suddenly remember rules they ignored 5 minutes earlier. So when I moved back into my father's house after my wife Eleanor passed away 3 years ago, I made a decision. I would simply be Nathan, the retired widower on Cedar Grove Lane, the guy who mowed his own lawn, the guy who fixed his own fence, the guy who waved at neighbors and minded his own business. For a while, it worked. Mornings started with coffee on the porch. Evenings ended with a book and the sound of cicadas humming through the oak trees. Peaceful, predictable, exactly what I wanted. Then Patty Whitmore became HOA President. The first time I met her, she arrived carrying a welcome basket and a smile polished enough to belong in a television commercial. The basket smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh cellophane. The smile never reached her eyes. She introduced herself, complimented the property, and within 3 minutes informed me that my storage shed violated updated community aesthetics. I remember staring at her while holding a blueberry muffin she had just given me. The shed had been there longer than she had lived in Texas. She spoke about community standards the way some people talk about religion. Everything was sacred. Everything required enforcement. Everything somehow became her business. Over the next year, Willow Creek Estates slowly transformed. New rules appeared. New fees appeared. New committees appeared. Every month seemed to bring another regulation tucked inside an envelope. Residents grumbled but rarely pushed back. Most had jobs, families, responsibilities. Fighting the HOA felt exhausting. Patty understood that. Bureaucracy was her favorite weapon because paperwork never needed to raise its voice. One afternoon, I watched her spend 15 minutes arguing with a retired schoolteacher over the placement of a bird feeder. Another week, she threatened fines against a veteran whose pickup truck remained parked in his own driveway. Every conflict followed the same pattern. Intimidation first. Negotiation second. Compassion never. The strange thing was that she barely noticed me in the beginning. I was quiet, predictable, unremarkable, exactly the kind of resident who disappears into the background. Then she discovered something she wanted. The small strip of wooded land behind my property. 3 acres of untouched oak and cedar bordering a drainage easement. Land my family had owned for decades. Land Patty had already included in a proposal for a future community expansion project. The moment she learned I would not sell, her attitude changed. The smiles became thinner. The letters became more frequent. And somewhere along the way, Patty Whitmore made the mistake that would eventually unravel everything. She stopped seeing me as a person. She started seeing me as an obstacle. The trouble really started the month Patty unveiled what she called the Willow Creek Expansion Initiative. The name sounded harmless enough. Most bad ideas do. I remember sitting in the clubhouse conference room listening to the hum of the air conditioning while residents flipped through glossy presentation packets. The smell of fresh printer ink filled the room. Patty stood at the front beside a projector screen wearing a cream-colored blazer and the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome before the meeting began. According to her presentation, the community needed additional recreational space, new walking paths, enhanced property value assets, and a larger gathering area for future events. The slides showed happy families, green lawns, and artist renderings of features that did not yet exist. People nodded politely. Some even applauded. Then one map appeared on the screen, and I immediately understood the problem. There it was, my wooded acreage, highlighted in bright green, labeled as future community reserve land. The room suddenly felt warmer. The projector fan buzzed steadily as Patty explained how the expansion would benefit everyone. What she conveniently failed to explain was that the land belonged to me. I raised my hand. She hesitated before acknowledging me. Her smile tightened. Nathan, do you have a question? I looked at the map. Yes. Why is my property included in your proposal? Several heads turned. Patty gave a short laugh that sounded rehearsed. We are exploring acquisition opportunities for underutilized parcels adjacent to community assets. Underutilized parcels. That was an interesting description for land my family had owned since before she graduated high school. I folded my arms. It is not available. The room went quiet. Patty maintained her smile, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the presentation remote. We have not reached that stage yet, she replied. This is simply a preliminary discussion. I nodded and said nothing else. The meeting continued. Residents asked questions about trails and landscaping. Patty answered every one of them confidently. Yet every few minutes, I caught her looking in my direction. The way a chess player watches a piece that refuses to move where expected. 2 days later, I received my first official violation notice. The envelope arrived by certified mail. The paper felt crisp between my fingers. Improper storage structure visibility. My storage shed. The same shed that had existed without issue for decades. I paid little attention to it. Then came another notice. Excessive vegetation near drainage easement. Then another. Fence maintenance review. Then another. Exterior appearance concern. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every week brought something new. Every notice required a response. Every response generated additional paperwork. One afternoon, I was repairing a section of fencing when my neighbor Frank Dawson walked across the property line carrying a bottle of water. Frank was a retired firefighter and one of the few people in the neighborhood who still said exactly what he thought. He handed me the bottle and shook his head. Patty is after your land. I glanced toward the trees. Sunlight filtered through the oak branches, casting moving shadows across the grass. I know. Frank looked uneasy. She has already told people the expansion is practically approved. She says everyone wins once the property changes hands. I laughed quietly. The sound surprised even me. Everyone except the owner. Frank gave a slow nod. Exactly. Over the next several weeks, strange things began happening at HOA meetings. Budget discussions suddenly referenced future expansion planning. Committee reports referenced projected acreage. Vendor proposals included conceptual drawings featuring property the association did not own. It was as if Patty had convinced herself ownership was merely a technical inconvenience. The more resistance she encountered, the more determined she became. And because I refused to argue publicly, she interpreted my silence as weakness. What Patty never understood was that years on the bench had taught me a valuable lesson. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. Real power comes from patience, from listening, from letting people reveal exactly who they are. So while Patty continued building her narrative, I continued collecting information. Meeting minutes, letters, notices, emails, small details most people ignored. The kind of details that become very important later. Because every time Patty pushed a little harder, she left another footprint behind. And eventually, those footprints started forming a trail. Patty's campaign accelerated the moment she realized I was not going to sell. The notices became more frequent, but what caught my attention was not the volume. It was the timing. Every new complaint seemed to appear immediately after an HOA board meeting. Every warning letter referenced discussions that supposedly represented community concerns. Yet when I spoke with actual neighbors, most had no idea those concerns even existed. One humid Thursday afternoon, I checked my mailbox and found 3 separate envelopes waiting inside. The metal door clicked shut with a hollow sound that echoed across the quiet street. The first envelope contained a notice regarding tree maintenance. According to the HOA, several branches on my property posed a potential aesthetic concern. Aesthetic concern. Not safety. Not damage. Aesthetic concern. The second letter claimed my driveway contained visible surface discoloration requiring corrective action within 30 days. The third informed me that my property had been scheduled for compliance review and possible financial penalties. I stood there under the Texas sun holding nearly 20 pages of paperwork and could not help smiling. The language was becoming increasingly desperate. That evening, I sat on my porch with a legal pad while cicadas buzzed in the trees overhead. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the neighborhood. Across the street, families walked dogs and children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, Patty was treating 3 acres of woodland like a military objective. The next HOA meeting confirmed my suspicions. The clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as residents settled in. Coffee brewed near the back wall, filling the room with the familiar scent of burnt beans and powdered creamer. Patty opened the meeting with her usual confidence. Financial updates. Landscaping proposals. vendor contracts. Then she introduced a special motion, a proposal authorizing preliminary planning expenditures related to future expansion opportunities. Most residents barely looked up from their agendas. The wording sounded harmless. It was not. Buried inside the proposal was authorization to spend association funds preparing reports, surveys, and legal consultations tied directly to land the HOA did not own. My land. I raised my hand. Patty visibly hesitated. Yes, Nathan. I glanced down at the proposal. Can you explain why community funds are being allocated toward property acquisition planning before any acquisition has occurred? Several heads turned. Patty shifted her posture. This is standard due diligence. Is there a signed agreement with the property owner? No. Has the property owner expressed interest in selling? Her jaw tightened. Not at this time. A quiet murmur spread through the room. The sound reminded me of wind moving through dry leaves. Small, subtle, dangerous. For the first time, residents began asking questions of their own. Questions Patty clearly had not anticipated. How much would the reports cost? Why was expansion suddenly urgent? Had alternative locations been considered? The meeting ended with fewer smiles than usual. That should have been the warning sign. Instead, Patty doubled down. The following week, contractors appeared near the edge of my property taking measurements. When I approached them, they politely explained they had been hired to evaluate future trail connectivity options. Future trail connectivity. Another phrase that sounded innocent until you realized the trail existed only on paper and crossed land the association did not control. A few days later, Frank Dawson knocked on my front door carrying a stack of copied documents. The smell of motor oil followed him from his garage. You need to see this, he said. We spread the papers across my kitchen table. Meeting minutes, committee notes, internal planning summaries. Frank had obtained them through a records request available to every homeowner. Several entries referenced expansion assumptions. Others referenced expected acquisition outcomes. One sentence caught my eye immediately. Property integration timeline pending final owner compliance resolution. I read it twice. Then a third time. Compliance resolution. They were no longer discussing a possible purchase. They were discussing ways to pressure the owner. The room felt very quiet after that. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees. Frank looked at me carefully. Nathan, I think she believes she can force this. I nodded slowly. The interesting thing was that Patty no longer seemed focused on buying the land. She appeared focused on making ownership inconvenient enough that I would eventually surrender. What she did not realize was that every letter, every motion, every contractor visit, and every committee note was creating a record. And records have a habit of surviving long after confidence disappears. By early autumn, the entire situation had evolved from irritating to absurd. The morning air carried the scent of damp leaves and fresh coffee as I stepped onto my porch one Saturday and found another certified envelope resting against my front door. The paper was still cool from the night air. I picked it up, already knowing who had sent it. Patty had discovered something important about most people. If you bury them under enough paperwork, eventually they stop fighting because they become tired. What she never understood was that I had spent decades reading documents for a living. Paper never intimidated me. Sloppy paper fascinated me. The latest notice claimed I owed administrative penalties connected to repeated compliance concerns. The amount itself was not remarkable. What caught my attention was the legal justification. Halfway through the second page, the association cited authority that did not actually exist within the governing documents. I walked back inside, sat at my kitchen table, and compared the notice against the HOA bylaws. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. 20 minutes later, I found the problem. Then another. Then another. The notice referenced sections that had either been amended years earlier or never existed at all. Someone had copied language from unrelated documents and hoped nobody would verify it. That afternoon, I attended another board meeting. The clubhouse smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Residents sat quietly while Patty worked through the agenda with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. When discussion reached enforcement matters, she announced that persistent noncompliance might require outside legal consultation. Several board members nodded. One avoided eye contact completely. I recognized that look. It was the expression people wear when they know something is wrong but do not want to become involved. After the meeting, Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. The evening air felt cooler than usual. Crickets chirped from the drainage ditch behind the clubhouse. Frank shoved his hands into his pockets and shook his head. She is escalating again. I know, I replied. He glanced around before lowering his voice. You ever notice how nobody asks where the legal budget keeps coming from? That question stayed with me. The following week, I submitted a routine records request available to every homeowner. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a request for financial reports, meeting records, and vendor authorizations. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly legal. The response arrived later than required. That was the first clue. The second clue appeared inside the documents themselves. Numbers that should have matched did not match. Payments appeared without supporting detail. Consulting expenses seemed unusually high. Legal review charges appeared months before any official authorization existed in meeting minutes. Individually, each discrepancy looked small. Together, they formed a pattern. The more I reviewed, the more interesting the picture became. Meanwhile, Patty seemed convinced she was winning. New notices continued arriving. New deadlines appeared. New threats followed. One letter warned that failure to cooperate could result in expanded enforcement actions. Another referenced possible legal remedies. A third implied that prolonged disputes might affect future assessments. The language grew increasingly aggressive, while the supporting facts grew increasingly weak. Then came the first real mistake. An internal committee summary accidentally reached homeowners through a distribution error. Most residents probably ignored it. I did not. Buried inside the document was a sentence discussing anticipated resolution of property acquisition barriers. Property acquisition barriers. Not negotiations. Not discussions. Barriers. The wording revealed exactly how Patty viewed the situation. Ownership itself had become an obstacle. I remember sitting alone on my back porch that evening reading the sentence again while wind moved through the oak trees. The smell of cedar drifted across the property. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a hawk called out into the fading light. For months, I had watched Patty construct a narrative where resistance automatically became misconduct. Now I had proof she was thinking several steps ahead of her actual authority. The remarkable part was not that she wanted the land. It was how confident she had become. Confidence creates carelessness. Carelessness creates records. And records create consequences. By the time October arrived, I could sense momentum shifting beneath the surface. Residents were beginning to ask questions. Board members looked uncomfortable during meetings. Financial reports attracted attention they had never received before. Yet Patty continued moving forward as if none of it mattered. She believed pressure solved every problem. She believed enough letters could manufacture compliance. Most of all, she believed the person standing in her way was simply an aging homeowner running out of options. And that belief was about to become the most expensive assumption she ever made. The week before everything finally came to a head felt strangely quiet. That alone made me suspicious. After months of notices, warnings, committee motions, and manufactured emergencies, the sudden silence felt unnatural. Like the moment before a thunderstorm when the wind disappears and even the birds stop making noise. 3 days passed without a single letter. No compliance notice. No demand for payment. No new violation report. Nothing. On Wednesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing property records while rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of coffee filled the room. A legal pad rested beside me covered in notes, dates, meeting references, and document numbers. Over the previous months, I had accumulated enough paperwork to fill an entire filing cabinet drawer. Most people would have considered it exhausting. I considered it educational. Every document told a story, and the story becoming visible was not the one Patty intended. Around noon, Frank called. His voice carried the rough tone of a man who had spent decades around sirens and smoke. Nathan, you hearing the rumors? I leaned back in my chair. What rumors? Patty has been telling people legal action is coming. Big legal action. Apparently, she has hired outside counsel. I looked toward the rain streaking across the glass. Interesting. Frank laughed without humor. She is acting like the whole thing is already finished. According to her, you are about to fold. After we hung up, I spent several minutes staring at the stack of documents on my table. Outside counsel. That explained the silence. Bureaucrats love paperwork. Ambitious bureaucrats love lawyers. By Thursday evening, the rumors had spread through the neighborhood. Residents whispered about emergency board consultations and enforcement proceedings. People who normally discussed football games and lawn equipment were suddenly debating legal strategy at mailboxes and driveways. Patty had successfully transformed an ordinary property dispute into neighborhood theater. The remarkable part was how confident she appeared. On Friday night, another board meeting took place. I attended quietly as always. The clubhouse smelled of fresh paint and carpet adhesive from a recent renovation project. Patty sat at the front of the room with unusual energy. Her smile seemed larger. Her posture seemed straighter. Several times she exchanged knowing glances with board members seated nearby. Near the end of the meeting, she announced that professional legal review was underway concerning unresolved compliance matters. She did not mention my name. She did not need to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. Several residents looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Frank rolled his eyes so dramatically I nearly laughed. Yet I remained silent. Silence can be remarkably useful. People tend to reveal far more when they think they are winning. The following Monday brought another surprise. A courier delivered a thick envelope shortly after lunch. The package contained correspondence from a private law firm. Formal language. Impressive letterhead. Expensive paper. The attorneys requested a meeting to discuss resolution opportunities and avoid future escalation. Resolution opportunities. Another pleasant phrase disguising an unpleasant objective. What caught my attention was not the request itself. It was the assumptions buried inside the letter. The attorneys clearly believed information provided by the HOA. Information that omitted important facts. Information that presented conclusions as established truths. Information that would become very awkward once examined closely. I responded politely and declined the meeting. 24 hours later, another letter arrived. This one carried a different tone. Less cooperation. More pressure. Deadlines appeared. Potential consequences appeared. References to future proceedings appeared. The escalation was becoming predictable. Then came Tuesday morning. The morning that would eventually become neighborhood legend. I woke before sunrise as usual. The air felt cool. A faint layer of fog hovered over portions of the property behind the house. Coffee brewed in the kitchen while early light filtered through the trees. Everything felt calm, ordinary, peaceful. At approximately 7 o'clock, I noticed a white Lexus parked farther down the street than normal. I recognized it immediately. A few minutes later, a black luxury SUV arrived and stopped in front of my house. 3 men stepped out wearing tailored suits and carrying folders. They moved with the confidence of professionals expecting a straightforward assignment. Through the front window, I watched them walk up my driveway. One checked a document. Another adjusted his tie. The third carried a folder thick enough to suggest months of preparation. The sound of their shoes crossing the wooden porch echoed through the quiet morning air. Then came the knock. Slow, deliberate, certain, as if they believed they were about to conclude a dispute. What none of them understood was that they were actually walking into the most important mistake Patty Whitmore had made since the day she first looked at my land and decided it belonged to her future plans. The oldest attorney recovered first. Years in courtrooms and conference rooms had probably taught him how to regain composure quickly. Still, I noticed the hesitation. It was there for only a fraction of a second, but it was there. His eyes moved from the robe to my face and then back again. The confidence he had carried up the driveway was suddenly gone. The morning air felt still. Somewhere across the street, a sprinkler clicked rhythmically against a patch of grass. Nobody spoke. Finally, the attorney holding the folder cleared his throat. "Judge Walker," he said carefully. I nodded once. "Good morning." Behind them, Patty remained frozen inside her Lexus. Even at that distance, I could see her leaning forward over the steering wheel, trying to understand why 3 experienced attorneys were no longer following whatever script she had imagined. The youngest lawyer shifted uncomfortably. His grip tightened around his tablet. The third attorney stared at the documents in his hands, as if hoping they might transform into something less problematic. I opened the screen door fully and stepped onto the porch. The black robe moved slightly in the breeze. Nobody expected dramatic reveals in real life. Real life rarely worked that way. Yet sometimes reality has a sense of timing. The senior attorney offered a professional smile that looked considerably weaker than it had a few minutes earlier. "We were not aware of your position," he admitted. I believed that. Patty probably never told them. Why would she? To her, I was simply the homeowner refusing to cooperate. The obstacle, the barrier, the inconvenience standing between her and the expansion project she had already convinced herself would happen. I folded my hands calmly. That much is obvious. The attorney glanced at the folder again. We are here on behalf of the association to discuss ongoing compliance matters and possible resolution options. Resolution options. I almost laughed. The phrase had become one of my favorites. People use language like that when they want something but prefer not to say it directly. I looked at the folder. Does that package contain the same allegations referenced in the letters your firm sent? The younger attorney answered before anyone else could. Yes, sir. I nodded. Then you may have a problem. The silence returned immediately. Not because I raised my voice. I did not. Not because I threatened anyone. I did not. Silence appears naturally when professionals realize critical information may have been withheld from them. The senior attorney straightened. What kind of problem? I met his eyes. The kind created when clients present assumptions as facts. The kind created when financial authority exceeds documented authorization. The kind created when internal records contradict official representations. Nobody moved. Even the sounds from the street seemed distant. I could almost hear gears turning inside their heads. Attorneys spend their careers identifying risk. Suddenly, they were discovering risk standing on a front porch. I stepped aside and gestured toward a small outdoor table beside the door. Several folders rested there neatly organized. Meeting minutes, financial reports, committee summaries, correspondence, months of material. The breeze lifted the corner of one page. I have spent quite a bit of time reviewing association records, I said. Some interesting questions emerged. The senior attorney looked toward the documents, but did not touch them. Questions regarding what? I smiled politely. Authorization procedures, budget allocations, record accuracy, property acquisition discussions involving land the association does not own. The youngest attorney visibly swallowed. The third lawyer finally spoke. Has any of this been formally raised? Multiple times. The answer landed harder than any accusation could have, because now they understood something important. If concerns had been raised repeatedly and ignored repeatedly, the situation became far more complicated than a simple enforcement dispute. Across the street, Patty opened her car door. She stepped out and began walking toward the house. Fast. Too fast. Her confidence had finally cracked. The click of her heels against the pavement echoed through the morning air. By the time she reached the driveway, the attorneys were no longer looking at me as a target. They were looking at me the same way experienced professionals look at an unexpected witness who already has the documents. And for the first time since this entire mess began, Patty Whitmore was the only person on the property who still believed she was in control. Patty reached the porch breathing harder than she wanted anyone to notice. The confidence that had carried her through months of meetings and notices was beginning to fray around the edges. The attorneys noticed it too. Professionals always notice when a client suddenly becomes nervous. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the wooden boards beneath our feet. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower started humming, but nobody on that porch paid attention. All eyes were on the folders resting beside me. Patty forced a smile. Nathan, I think there has been a misunderstanding. That was the first time in months she had used my first name without attaching some kind of accusation to it. I almost admired the adjustment. Almost. The senior attorney turned toward her. Mrs. Whitmore, can we have a moment? The tone had changed. Earlier, it had carried confidence. Now it carried caution. Patty immediately sensed the difference. Her smile weakened. The attorney stepped a few feet away with her near the edge of the driveway. I remained where I was. There was no need to follow. The outcome was already beginning to unfold. Through years on the bench, I learned that people reveal the truth most clearly when they think nobody is listening. Their conversation stayed quiet, but their body language spoke loudly. Patty pointed toward my property several times. The senior attorney responded with short questions. The younger lawyer opened his tablet and began reviewing notes. The third attorney examined several pages from their file before slowly lowering them. Every passing minute seemed to remove another layer of certainty. 20 minutes later, they returned. The senior attorney's expression had become completely professional. Judge Walker, he said carefully, we would appreciate the opportunity to review certain records you referenced. Of course, I replied. For the next hour, documents moved across the outdoor table. Meeting minutes, financial summaries, budget authorizations, internal memoranda, property planning proposals, correspondence chains. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret, just records. The kind of records people often ignore until they become important. The younger attorney spent nearly 10 minutes comparing dates between meeting minutes and expenditure reports. The third attorney reviewed authorization language tied to consulting contracts. The senior attorney read silently for so long that even Patty stopped talking. The breeze carried the smell of cedar from the tree line behind the house. Pages turned. Pens moved across paper. Nobody smiled anymore. Eventually, the senior attorney closed the final folder. The sound seemed unusually loud. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Patty. Several questions require clarification. Patty opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried again. I can explain. The attorney nodded politely. I am sure you can. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because anyone raised their voice. Not because anyone made threats. Because the narrative had collapsed. For months, Patty controlled the story. She controlled the meetings. She controlled the letters. She controlled the pressure campaign. But facts are stubborn things. Once enough of them gather in one place, stories stop working. Within 2 weeks, multiple reviews began moving through channels that had nothing to do with HOA politics. Financial oversight questions appeared. Governance concerns appeared. Requests for supporting documentation appeared. Several board members suddenly became very interested in previous meeting records. Homeowners began asking sharper questions during meetings. Attendance increased. Conversations changed. The clubhouse no longer felt like Patty's kingdom. It felt like a room full of people discovering details they should have known months earlier. Frank Dawson called me one evening while I sat on my porch watching the sunset filter through the oak trees. The sky glowed orange above the property Patty had wanted so badly. You hear the latest. I smiled into my coffee mug. Which latest? 2 board members resigned. Another requested an independent review. Frank laughed. Sounds like people finally started reading documents. That tends to happen, I said. By the end of the month, the expansion proposal disappeared completely. No speeches. No announcements. No grand explanations. It simply vanished from every agenda as if it had never existed. The same people who once spoke confidently about future acquisition opportunities now avoided discussing the subject at all. And the most remarkable part was that none of it required power plays or dramatic confrontations. It required patience. Records. Facts. The very things Patty had underestimated from the beginning. Winter arrived quietly that year. The oak trees behind my house shed their leaves one slow gust at a time, covering the ground in shades of gold and brown. Every morning, I carried a mug of coffee onto the porch and watched sunlight move across the same 3 acres that had started the entire mess. The air smelled cleaner now, calmer. The tension that had lingered over Willow Creek estates for months had finally begun to fade. Change happened gradually at first. Then all at once, the independent reviews expanded. Homeowners requested additional records. Financial questions multiplied. Board meetings became longer and far less comfortable for people who had grown accustomed to operating without scrutiny. Residents who once sat quietly in the back of the room started asking direct questions. The answers were rarely satisfying. One by one, the assumptions that had supported the expansion project collapsed under examination. Proposed expenditures lacked proper approval. Committee recommendations exceeded their authority. Several planning discussions had been presented as community decisions before any legitimate vote occurred. None of it looked particularly good once sunlight reached it. Patty tried to maintain control. For a while, she even managed to sound confident. But confidence built on assumptions has a short shelf life. Every meeting became more difficult than the last. Every explanation generated additional questions. Every attempt to move forward led people backward toward records they had previously ignored. By January, another board member stepped down. Then another. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse changed completely. The room no longer belonged to a small group making decisions behind polished presentations and carefully chosen language. It belonged to homeowners again. One evening, Frank Dawson called while I was stacking firewood near the side of the house. The smell of cedar drifted through the cold air. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Not currently. You might want to." I laughed. "What happened now?" "Patty resigned this afternoon." The words hung in the air for a moment. Not because they surprised me, because they felt inevitable. Frank continued talking. Apparently, she cited personal reasons. Wants to spend more time focusing on other priorities. I smiled. That is usually how these things are phrased. The next board meeting confirmed it. A new interim president took over. The expansion proposal was officially withdrawn. Several governance reforms were introduced. Financial transparency requirements increased. Homeowner access to records expanded. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Real victories rarely look dramatic. They look like ordinary people quietly reclaiming responsibility. A few weeks later, I ran into one of the attorneys who had visited my porch that morning months earlier. We crossed paths at a legal conference several counties away. He recognized me immediately. We exchanged polite greetings. Before leaving, he paused and smiled. You know, Judge Walker, that was one of the more educational client meetings of my career. I laughed. I imagine it was. He shook his head. Most people underestimate documentation. Then he walked away. Standing there, I realized he had summarized the entire situation perfectly. Patty underestimated records. She underestimated patience. Most of all, she underestimated the difference between authority and power. Authority is what people claim to have. Power is what remains when the paperwork gets examined. By spring, life had returned to normal. The letters stopped. The notices stopped. The rumors stopped. Children rode bicycles through the neighborhood again. Neighbors talked about gardening, football, and weather instead of legal disputes. The clubhouse returned to being a clubhouse instead of a battlefield disguised as a meeting room. One Saturday morning, I sat on my porch watching sunlight filter through fresh green leaves. Birds moved through the tree line behind the property. The same property. Still untouched. Still mine. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and cedar across the yard. My coffee tasted especially good that morning. Across the street, a neighbor waved. I waved back. No lawyers arrived. No notices appeared. No expansion plans resurfaced. Just silence. Honest silence. The kind that comes after a long storm finally passes. Looking back, the funniest part was how simple the entire lesson turned out to be. Nobody lost because someone shouted louder. Nobody won because someone held a title. The outcome came down to facts. Facts written in meeting minutes. Facts buried in reports. Facts preserved in records. Facts that refused to disappear no matter how much pressure people applied. The 3 acres remained exactly where they had always been. The house remained exactly where my father built it. And every once in a while, when I walked through those trees, I remembered that morning on the porch. The moment confidence met documentation. The moment assumptions met reality. Because justice is not loud. It does not need to be. It waits. It watches. And eventually, it arrives right on schedule.